everybody, and mahalo for coming to this month's Mālama Pūpūkea-Waimea Marine Science Talk Story. We're really excited to have Nakoa Gu with us today. And I wrote out a little introduction bio for you so I could do Nakoa some justice. I was joking that I didn't want to just say he's super awesome brother and we like him a lot. So I thought that I would say some technical things. So Nakoa is originally from Puna on Hawaii Island. He's an avid lawai'a who cares about the condition of our marine resources for future generation. He's currently working on his PhD in marine biology at UH Manoa, focusing on ecology of forage fish. Also contributes time as a member of the Hawaii Environmental Education Alliance, works with Hui Mālama Local I'a with Kua'aina Ulu Awamo, participates with that, and also the Papahana Mokuakea Reserve Advisory Council. So busy guy. So without further ado, Nakoa, mahalo nui. I'm just going to pass it right to you.
All right. Aloha, mai kākou. Mahalo for having me here today to present. Good to see that a lot of my friends and partners and colleagues are over here joining in the talk today. And I wanted it to be more of this kind of like a general talk story, you know, kind of about like my progress so far in my PhD research that's focused on forage fish. So I'm going to be kind of jumping around to the different kind of lines of research that I'm working on. Some is based in genetics, some is based in looking at historical research, documents, and also experiences from different lawai'a or fishermen in Hawaii. And as we go along, feel free to ask questions or put things in the chat, and Jenny will try to get my attention, and maybe we can have a good discussion as well after the presentation. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And is everything looking okay? Looking good? All right. So my presentation today is a Hānai ai maka Muliwai, assessments of forage fish ecology in Hawaii estuaries. And that phrase, a Hānai ai, it kind of refers to, you know, processing, taking in knowledge and processing it and trying to understand it. And in this case, I'm focusing more on the Muliwai, or our estuaries. And kind of what led me to study forage fish happened to be, it wasn't something I was set on or intending to do when I applied to graduate school. I kind of knew that I wanted to focus broadly on some type of fish because my background was more in doing coral reef based surveys for aquarium fish, or comparing marine protected areas inside and outside to see what those differences are. And that was kind of my background before I went into an education position at the Mokupapapa Discovery Center, where I worked for about 5 years. And then later I went to the Nature Conservancy. I worked as a marine fellow. And that's kind of where I developed my research proposal, was during that time as a fellow with Bert, who's also on this call. And what led me to want to focus on the forage fish was understanding the history of its importance in Hawaii's economy as our main fishery before longlining, and also understanding that that fish is really important because it also is feeding what a lot of us like to catch in the estuaries, you know, fish like papio, different kinds of carnivores that are targeted by recreational fishing. But it was also used to support this commercial fishery for aku, the pole and line aku fishery. And also what I knew was that, you know, the habitats where these fish are found are often difficult to access today because they tend to be in our major ports and harbors, which are protected for national security reasons. Often places like Pearl Harbor, one of the main habitats for forage fish is highly militarized. So access to these places is often difficult or restricted, and they often happen to be very polluted and degraded environments due to human activities and their importance, as our major ports and harbors where all of our goods and services come into. So first, I guess I would start off with explaining what actually is a forage fish, or what are forage fish. And they are small or intermediate sized fish, so they don't grow very large. They often mature very quickly within a span of weeks, maybe months for some of the bigger sized ones. They often are schooling in their behavior. They form dense aggregations when you do see them. So really big schools, but hard to tell what the fish actually are because they're so small. They have short generation times, which means they potentially are able to respond quicker to or adapt quicker to environmental changes, because they're gonna reproduce quickly. And also those short generation times means that they, whether for good or bad, they can respond differently. Their genetics can also be affected. So the genetic diversity they have can also be affected by them having these short generations. And if there's a high amount of mortality or death, the next generations are going to see maybe a consequence of that. But on the positive side of that is that short generation time means they can recover quickly, and they sort of go through these boom or bust cycles where there's a lot of them for a long period, and then maybe they die back, but they're able to come back again when conditions are right. They're also vulnerable to being eaten at all of their life stages. So they're vulnerable to predation during all stages of their life cycle. And they tend to be, some of the more well-known forage fish include sardines, anchovies, sprat, herrings, and silver sides. So and most of us in Hawaii don't tend to think about that. Like when I grew up, I didn't really know the difference between any of these little fish. They all kind of look the same. And it's also easy to mix them up with other native fish that grow larger, like juvenile mullet, little papillos. They often will be in the same kind of mix of species, even ahole as well. And the 3 chapters that I'm looking at for my separate assessments of forage fish ecology, how I have them currently split up, are first looking into the historic side of what is known about the Nehu fishery. And there's a lot of research that was conducted between the 1950s to the 1980s on forage fish. And once the aku fishery declined and was kind of phased out, that research, there's basically been no studies done on these fish. The last report was published in the early 90s. So there's this big data gap. And looking through historic research on the fishery, about the trends in what people are looking at about the bait fish, hasn't been updated since then, but it provides really important clues for trying to inform like future management of these species. And also speaking with fishermen who participated in the aku fishery is important as well. So I've been setting up interviews with some of these fishermen who still know what it was like during that time, and sort of what were the fishing practices and methods, both from a traditional Hawaiian Lavaita sense and also that commercial fishery side. And there's a lot of parallels and like differences in what how the fishery operated from like more the traditional Hawaiian side versus commercial extraction. And my second chapter is focused on understanding the diet of different species of forage fish, to sort of reconstruct the food web in our estuaries and compare them between islands to see, you know, what is happening in this food chain. And sort of, I forgot to say this earlier, but sort of the underlying reason and purpose behind this research is that our native forage fish are not really as abundant as they used to be historically. And that could be for, you know, tons of reasons, but there's a noticeable decline in the presence and also the abundance of these fish. But nobody can really explain why. There's a lot of clues about and I guess predictions of what is causing it, but nobody really knows. So I'm trying to sort of look at different approaches to narrow that down to maybe and provide some like more concrete evidence for those reasons that are causing the decline. So by looking at the diet, using a more genetics-based approach, research approach, I'm hoping to reconstruct the food web, because these fish are at the base of the food web. So trying to reconstruct what's happening at that base level and understand if these fish are competing with each other. More importantly, an introduced bait fish or forage fish that's called the gold spot herring. And it hasn't really been studied well so far since it was introduced in the 1970s. So I'm trying to see if it's potentially competing with or even eating our native species. And also seeing if the diets of these fish vary between different islands or different, even within the same island at different estuaries. And then my third chapter is using theoretical ecology is kind of what the term is for this type of research, and using ecological modeling. So a lot of it is based in math and computer programming to predict, you know, predict how a population of these fish will respond to either competition with an introduced species, or also if there's some type of management action that we implement, whether it's like improving the habitat quality or removing introduced competitors, and trying to predict how the native populations will respond to those types of management actions. And all of this too is also to try and address the concerns of local communities about where these fish were famous and where they were caught and consumed historically. So that's also another thing I'm hoping to gain from this research. And here's just a list of the historic sites where nehu were harvested commercially, also for historically, but for by Hawaiians for supporting either you know, the Hawaiians would eat these fish either just dried or even half dried, but they'd also use them for bait or preserve them for bait as well. And so on Oahu, we have the highest volume of forage fish was caught on Oahu, and mainly from Kaneohe Bay and Pearl Harbor. Those were like the two most important sites in the state. But also the Alawai, they were caught in Kewalo, and also in North Shore in Haleiwa and Waialua Bay. And the name I found out that one of the historic names of Pua'ena Point was called Nehu. That was like a name of that place. So the names of the places provide clues as well to, you know, what species are found there. And then in Maui, Ma'alaya, Kihei, Lahaina, Kahului. In Kahului Harbor, one of the main impacts from the construction of the harbor was that the habitat shifted in that harbor to being like very much sediment covered, you know, very compacted with this fine sand. And from what I learned is that historically there was actually a lot of limu in those areas in the bay. And also in that limu, it's thought that the food that the forage fish were trying to prey on were dependent on that habitat, of being macroalgae dominated. And that's potentially one reason why there's not really as much forage fish seen in Kahului Harbor today. And then on the Big Island, there's Hilo, Kauai, Mahukona, Kailua Kona. Kauai, I haven't been able to sample in Kauai, mainly because of the pandemic and the travel restrictions during when I had my permits active. But I hope to include those sites at some point. And then in Molokai, I just have one species of forage fish that I'm including in my study. And here's just an old map of, where the location of the Oahu baiting areas were. And when some of the fisheries data came out for Nehu was in like from the 70s to 60s is really when they were tracking it well, how much they were taking on a monthly basis from these areas. Okay. And so looking at the historical research or Kawamamua, looking into the past, some of the places where Nehu and other forage fish pop up are in our different mo'olelo, where they're mentioned, like in the story of Umialiloa, when he comes to invade Hilo, there's a fisherman who's catching Nehu off the coast, and he notices Umi and his men marching, and he goes to, it says like he's catching his Nehu, and then he sees them, so he goes up into the hill and to ambush them, and he kills a bunch of them before they notice him. But then one of Umi's warriors finds the fisherman and kills him, and then there's no one to warn Hilo that they're about to come and invade. So that's one place where it's mentioned. Also in the story of Kiha Pi'ilani, who was one of the famous chiefs of Maui. Before he rises to power, his brother is actually the chief of Maui after their father dies. And then he insults Kiha Pi'ilani by throwing Nehu in his face. And then so because of that insult, Kiha Pi'ilani, he leaves Maui and gains support on the Big Island, and then comes back and conquers Maui. And then also in different earlier chants, Nehu are mentioned. Vahipana, like I talked about, Pua'ena Point was named Nehu. There's fishing traditions and like a whole category of terms, terminology, and also names of implements that were specific for fishing with forage fish off of canoes. There's also Olelo no Eao, which I'll share next. And then in Hawaiian newspapers, it's important to look into these because this article that you see on the right came from a Hawaiian newspaper and published in the early 1900s. And it talks about this man who disagrees with a law that's implemented that restricts the size of the nets for catching Nehu in Kahului Harbor. And he says that the nets are too small, the maximum size. He disagrees with their regulations. So to me, it's like an example, a very early example of Hawaiian fishers disagreeing with a Western-based form of management. And I'll show you guys later, like sort of the progression of those rules for that are meant for managing forage fish harvesting. And then also the interviews that I'm doing with the fishermen are really important for understanding like the timing and the scale of different impacts and changes that happen in different sites, and using those as sort of like, placing a sort of benchmark and point in time on when a certain impact happened to predict how that was a negative impact on the forage fish in certain areas. And here's some of the Olelo no Eao specific just to Nehu, but there's other native forage fish, not just Nehu, which I'll talk about later. But here's just some of them. And the first one is Hiua he'e Nehu no Kalawai'a. which talks about the he'e nehu rain that precedes the coming of the nehu fish. It's more specific to Hilo Harbor. So it gives you clues about, the nehu need fresh water. That's what basically it tells me. And you will find them when this certain rain comes, and that's how we know when was a good time to find these fish. Even if that rain doesn't occur today, we can at least associate these fish, with specific types of environmental conditions and habitats. The next one is Hili Nehu Kamalama Kukanehu. And Hili Nehu is the name of a month, the month of January in Hilo, or at least for the Big Island. It's one of the names for January. And so it gives us a locator on the seasonality and the timing of when these fish historically were coming into these areas. And then Aya I Kahuki Nehu Kaia Kaulana o Ka'aina. So this phrase means gone to get the nehu fish, the famous fish of the land. And so it lets us know that it was a famous fish that was consumed and probably very abundant, very common historically in our estuaries. Hekai puhi nehu puhi lala kekai o eva. And that talks about the bubbling of the nehu fish at the surface. The puhi is like when you see like a blowhole exploding, And oftentimes when I see them, there's other fish eating them and they're kind of exploding at the surface. And it kind of looks like if you flick water. That's the only description I have of it. But it tells us in Eva, it was a famous ocean because, there were probably a lot of these schools just always around in the ocean there. But a lot of the fish ponds in the Eva region are currently, they've been filled in, and the water in Pearl Harbor fronting Eva is pretty polluted. But these fish, they're still in there, but maybe those impacts are causing them to not be the same as they were. And then the last saying is, Ako e kahalea pa'a ike komo ana mai o ka ho'oilo. Ole e kulu I ka ua o hili nehu. And that saying talks about how it's smart to prepare the roof on your house and thatch it well, or if there's any holes before the hili nehu rain comes, because if not, you're gonna be sorry. So it talks about preparing for what might happen beforehand, so that you don't get soaked in the rain. And the reason why forage fish are also valuable for different reasons, they have a very important functional role in the ecosystem, and not really in Hawaii. We don't really see this in Hawaii compared to more temperate waters like in Alaska or the Northern Pacific, where there's much larger biomass and larger school sizes of these fish. And they tend to be a very important link in the food chain because they're transferring energy from the level of phytoplankton and zooplankton and bringing that energy through the higher trophic levels or higher up in the food chain. And they're an important part of the diet of animals like seals, dolphins, whales. That's what these animals are consuming in bulk, along with other fish maybe, or things like krill, that are very abundant. So in that way, they're supporting the productivity of an ecosystem by quickly transferring the energy too, because how I talked about the fast generation time. So it's about them taking the energy and rapidly transferring it up higher in the food chain to support all those other species. But in the Hawaii, our estuaries tend to be where these fish live. And those are only in certain places, where there's not an estuary, we see reefs, we have coral reefs on our islands. But in those estuaries, these fish are providing an important food source for things like seabirds, also for predatory fish. like our papios, kaku, the barracudas, anything that eats fish will probably wanna prey on these forage fish. But then in Hawaiian culture, these fish hold a significant place because there's places named for them. There's rains like Ka'ua He'e Nehu, times of the year, Hili Nehu, and also their importance as a bait for catching fish. And one good example of that is in Kaneohe, where I found out that Nehu was used for catching omaka, which is a very small papio that's not really seen or caught too often. It's not as abundant as it used to be. And potentially the decline in the native forage fish might be responsible for that. But the ocean goes in cycles, things change all the time. So it's not like things are gonna stay the same permanently. These fish and different species they kind of have their time, they're abundant at certain times and then things change. But economically as well, forage fish tend to be some of the most exploited fish on earth. In terms of like biomass, they account for about 30 to 40% of global fisheries landings, and that's worth about 17 billion a year. So that also has a negative impact too on all the species that depend on these fish as well. And here's just some pictures from the aku fishery. So you get a sense, for the scale of the fishery and the fact that there needed to be a lot of bait that they caught to supply these boats constantly to go out. And there were periods of bait shortages that are noted in newspapers and reports from different points in time. Like there's one in the 50s, there's one in the 70s. So we know that these fish were vulnerable to facing decline at certain points in time. And they rebounded and they were pretty steadily harvested commercially from about these fish were, the aku fishery, it had sort of two different periods, because from the early 1900s to the 1940s, it went through this period of expansion where the fishery started growing and there was bigger boats, the sampan boats, which could do more of a larger scale harvesting effort. But then in World War II, all the people who own these boats, a lot of them lost their boats because they were Japanese owned. And the US government, after Pearl Harbor was bombed, they closed the fishery and boats couldn't really travel freely throughout Hawaii during World War II. And so after World War II, the fishery started back up again. And so it saw a lot of changes during that time, because the fishery closed and then had to reopen, and then they had to create a cannery and a system of processing all the fish that was being caught so it could be exported and sold locally. And for my research on the diet work that I'm doing, here's the 4 species that I'm focusing on. So first is the nehu, the Hawaiian anchovy. It's endemic to Hawaii, so it's not found anywhere else. But there are other relatives of nehu found in other places in the Pacific. And then the next one is the Hawaiian silverside, or the iao. And the iao is another endemic species. It tends to be more common, what I found, in the nehu. And they grow about twice as big as nehu as well. And then the next species is the gold spot herring, which was introduced in the early 1970s. And a tuna boat came from the Marshall Islands into Kewalo Harbor and dumped them. And from that original population, they've spread throughout the entire main Hawaiian Islands. And they tend to be the most common forage fish I see anywhere that I go and sample. So to me, they're established statewide at this point, but not much is known about what type of impact they might be having in the estuaries. And then piha is, it's indigenous to Hawaii. It's found in other places in the Pacific, and it's harvested as a bait fish as well. And I only have one population of them that I found in Hilo. And like I said, these fish are seasonal, yeah. So I only saw this fish in doing like 3 years of monitoring and collecting. I only saw a lot of them last summer on the Big Island. They were all over the Kona coastline. And then when I tried to throw my net on them, they were too small to get caught in the net. Like they were so tiny. So I ended up getting a Hilo population. But the rest of these species, I found in every location. And so I have 5 sites, Haleiwa, He'eia, and Pu'uloa on Oahu, Ma'alaia on Maui, and Hilo on the Big Island. And a little bit more about gold spot herring. They grow larger than both iao and nehu. So a maximum size, I'd say, is about like almost a shaka length. 6 inches would be a real big one. And if you ever go to Haleiwa Harbor, you might see them because there's like a big school of them, and they sort of go around, and at certain points in the day, they'll just fly through the whole inner boat harbor, and you'll see the water exploding behind them. So they're pretty abundant when you see them. There's a lot of these guys out there. So we know that they were introduced in 1971, and by 1975 they were first seen in Kaneohe Bay. So these species, it was introduced and it sort of steadily progressed and was able to establish. There were other bait fish that were brought in, species that were meant to be replacements for nehu during shortages, which was a pretty bad idea. But there was a species called the Marquesan sardine that was introduced, and it never really established. I saw it one time during my first year of grad school before I had my permits to collect, and I saw them in Lanikai, but that was it. I haven't seen them anywhere since then. So it's not very common, that species. But tilapia was brought in as a replacement bait, and this other species called shad, threadfin shad, that was introduced into Lake Wilson, but thankfully it hasn't really spread from there. Top minnow is another one. So all these species, the solution back then was thinking, oh, if there's gonna be a shortage of nehu, then we can bring in these other species to supplement for them. But none of those supplement baits ever really took off, as like a solution or became a real good solution. And some of the potential impacts of gold spot herring are that they could be competing with nehu and iao. They could be eating them, or their juveniles. They could also, there's some evidence too that they could be potentially toxic. So there's one incidence of a fisherman from Kauai dying from eating a Marquesan sardine and the cause of death was determined to be clupiotoxism, which is clupeid fish are fish like nehu. So that's where that word comes from. But sort of it's similar to ciguatera. And it's thought that if these fish consume things like zoanthids, which are relatives of coral, which have a toxin in them, then it stays in their body. And if we eat it, we can catch that toxin. And so the diet work I'm doing might give some clues as to, if these fish are potentially harmful to human health if we eat them. And here's just a historic timeline of the forage fish management in Hawaii. So from this, we can see that, these fish must have been important historically, because there's been different management rules for almost 100 years for these fish. And starting with the days of the Hawaii Territory, where there was that 12-foot net length limit, like that article I talked about, that's what they were mad about, was they thought it was too small of a size. and you could face a fine of $250 to 6 months in jail. Then the net length increased. And then you could take up to 100 pounds per day for commercial use, or consume them for as bait or at home consumption. So there's all these series of laws. And then today, what the laws for catching forage fish are that you can't take more than a gallon of nehu or iao per day, and you can't use a net longer than 50 feet to catch them. And there's prohibited areas, so you can't take forage fish from Kahului and Hilo Harbor. And so those are the rules that have been in place for quite a while now, I guess from the 70s through today. But most of them have to deal with fishing gear regulations, and not really looking at other things that might be causing their decline, like impacts to their habitat or introduced species. And so from the historic research, some of the predicted causes of decline in forage fish are pollution, whether it be from development, coastal development, or streams being blocked off, or pollutant sewage being discharged into estuaries, introduced species, overfishing, freshwater diversion. So a lot of our streams are diverted or not flowing like they used to be. Habitat fragmentation, which kind of means like when a certain habitat gets degraded or blocked off, maybe a road gets paved or a seawall gets put in, that can disrupt that species' ability to migrate or move around in the habitat. And then an interesting one is that thinking about bycatch from the commercial fishery, and bycatch of fish like mullet, important fish that people want to catch to consume for subsistence reasons. Those fish could potentially have been caught as bycatch by the commercial harvesting of bait fish. So there's no data on that at all. But I found out in Kaneohe, the community complained at one point because they were saying you were catching all of the juvenile mullet in the nets and using them in the tuna boats. So there's no data on that at all, as far as I know. And then from the interviews, figuring out the timing of different impacts, how far reaching they were, when different phase shifts happen. So phase shifts, when I say that, I mean like, when did a certain species come in and sort of dominate and take over an area, like mangrove? Or when did the limu disappear from Kahului Harbor? And that's sort of a big phase shift in an environment. And then also documenting the fishing methods, the experiences of the fishermen, and the lexicon or the terminology behind these practices. Because, when we can't catch these fish and the practices and knowledge behind them also becomes lost, then nobody's gonna know anything about these fish. And today, it's not really common knowledge where these fish live or how they were used. And yeah, I'll go on to my next one. So, but before I go on, does anyone have anything they wanna ask or any comments in the chat? Okay, so I guess I'll keep going. And so my second chapter is focused on using a technique called DNA metabarcoding to assess the diet of forage fish. And this technique has been around for a while, and it's a very, how do you say it? Like, it's a way to look at what's in a degraded environmental sample. So a lot of diet studies, this technique has been important to find the diet of not just fish, but like maybe endangered species like bears, animals that are difficult to track down or locate. This technique can be used to find what's in that sample, that environmental sample, to figure out what species are consuming. And so basically you start with taking the environmental sample. So for me, it's fish stomachs that I had to cut out individually, extracting the DNA from them, then amplifying certain parts of the cell of the DNA to find different types of species, which I'll talk about later, different groups of species, like say plankton, zooplankton, which are animals, versus phytoplankton, which are algae, versus bacteria. So that's what I mean by different types of DNA you're trying to amplify. And then the next step is to sequence those samples and get the genetic sequences, and then compare them to a known database, which is called like a blast search, to find what species match the database that are in your sample to the closest level of species that they can find. And so you basically, in the end, I'm hoping to get, a bunch of groups of species that are found in the stomachs of the fish. And so here's just to show you guys, like, the last diet study that was done on any forage fish in Hawaii was published in 1951. And this is what they found, sort of. So this gives me some clues for nehu, at least, what I might expect to find in their diets. So we see a lot of zooplankton, but we can see that it varies, between locations. So there's a lot of small invertebrate animals like copepods, barnacles, but it's hard to say if, has their diet shifted or have changes occurred in the environment since then that have caused their diet to change. And so here's sort of an overlook of like the project to look at their diet. And the reason this method is called DNA metabarcoding is because at the step when you amplify the DNA of each sample, you attach a specific barcode to that primer. And what that does is it allows you in the end, when you're looking at all your sequences, to tell each fish apart from each other. So it's a lot of work to make sure you have the right combination of primers, so that you're not mixing up samples incorrectly. And so imagine, I have 48 fish that have a barcode on them that are unique to them. Then I can group them all together and then sequence their DNA all together as one pool, which cuts down the cost of doing the sequencing a lot. So that's part of the reason we do this method, is because, you're trying to be cost effective at the same time, or else it would cost you 48 times that amount of sequencing effort just to do one sample, instead. So I have 16 populations. And so it's like I have 5 populations of the first 3 species, the nehu, the gold spot herring, and iao, and then 1 population of piha. And then the genetic markers I'm using, the different parts of the cell I'm trying to amplify. The names for the primers are CO1, which is to try and focus more on invertebrate species, 23S, which is more focusing on algae, and then 16S, which is focused on bacteria. And so imagine there's 16 populations times 24 fish times 3 primers. And so it's like, it gets very complicated quickly trying to organize all the samples. And each step you take, in processing the samples, there's no guarantee it's going to work. So, so it's a lot of troubleshooting, going back and forth, trying to get the samples to go through every step. And I'm almost at the last step of library preparation for this. So it's taken quite a while to get everything sort of in order. And then what I'm trying to find with their diet is looking at what zooplankton, phytoplankton are in their diet, pathogens and bacteria, and potentially different species that might be toxic that are in their diet, that might have these different types of toxins. And then I start with collection. So I had to get permits to collect these samples from the state of Hawaii, a special activities permit. I had to find the fish, which was, finding nehu was very difficult. most populations of nehu I found, I only saw them one time in that place, and I went a lot of times to go and sample. So I would see a lot of gold spot herring, a lot of yao, but nehu a lot of times is by chance, and they're only there for a certain amount of time. So some of my kilo or my observations I had to make were learning what each species was by their colors, their behaviors, their habitat preferences. They're all different. So that took a long time to figure out. And then also understanding their shifts in abundance when they're seasonally more abundant. And that changes as well. And then after that, I extracted the stomachs of the fish individually the best I could. It's very small, these fish, so it takes a lot of time to do this. But once you get the stomach, and then you can find the different parts, So I try to collect the whole stomach as much as possible, open it up. So when I extract the DNA, that I'm getting as much of the species and the mix in there as possible. And then something I've started to do to verify what's in the diet of the fish is using microscopy. And we have a confocal microscope lab at where I work at HIMB. And I can use that to kind of cross-check what I see in the DNA sequences to make sure, I'm seeing the right things. And so here's just a couple pictures of what's in there. So this is the body of a shrimp without its head on the left, and another animal called an ostracod on the top right. And then for my third chapter, looking at ecological modeling, I've created a real simple form of a population model for nehu. And it's a 2-species model where what you're seeing is how the population size of nehu and gold spot herring change as competitors against each other, and also with fisheries harvest. And then at different time steps. So it's modeling what we call a stochastic process, or a process that takes place over many time steps. And the population size changes at each time step. So this is why math is important for all the students thinking about coming into graduate school or studying ecology. It was good for me too to relearn, the importance of applying math to figure out ways to manage and protect resources better. It's an important tool we can use. And so I based the harvest data on fisheries landings of nehu from Oahu. The model data I'll show you is more specific to Kaneohe Bay. And so this is just to show you how you set the parameters for the model. So for harvest, you can assume a rate of harvest that doesn't go higher than the maximum value here. So about 320,000 pounds a year. And then you can use the low end and sort of get an average harvest level. And then this is what the more mathematical side of the model looks like. And this is a very simple 2-species competition model that was published, I believe, in the 1960s. So this isn't new at all, but we can still look back to these simple forms of models and try to apply them to an ecosystem in Hawaii today. And so this is what it looks like, sort of the projections of the model, if you only look at fishing pressure and not competition with the introduced species. And so at level 1 of the harvest, you see the nehu population. The prediction is that over time, from the 1960s through today, at a certain harvest level, the average harvest level H1, that the nehu population will rise and then stabilize at a certain point. And then it has these oscillations, where it's relatively staying the same. If you double the harvest level, that kind of stays the same as well. But when you quadruple the harvest level, the population sharply declines, and then it stabilizes at a reduced rate. And then when you increase it even more to almost 5 times the first harvest level, the population crashes. And so by looking at this, it helps us to predict, what level of fisheries harvest could have been happening, or what was the impact it had on Nehu populations, without any regard to, this is with like an unlimited food supply and no other impacts happening. This next set of graphs is if we include competition with gold spot herring and fishing pressure. And then from this, we can see different things. When we adjust the competition coefficient is what it's called, or it's sort of like how strong is the other species competing with each other. And what we see is even at a very low level, like 0.2, the gold spot herring will establish themselves at a higher abundance level than Nehu. And as we increase that coefficient to like 0.3, 0.4, the gap only widens, yeah? So it shows you like, okay, if some simple form of competition is happening and the gold spot herring are maybe using resources better, or they don't have the same predators as where they came from, it's giving them a competitive advantage. And at a certain level, the gold spot herring completely overtake the Nehu and the Nehu will crash. But how to set the value on this, there's a lot of, you can't just say one value is the only value because the ecosystem's always changing. And so this final plot is to show you, it's called a bifurcation heat map. And it's showing you, if we simulate that level of harvest, like sort of all levels of harvest and competition over a 56-year time period, from when we started to get data in the 60s till today, at any point, at any level of competition or harvest, this is what the size of the Nehu population will be. And this is in millions, tens of millions. So think 35 million to 20 million down here, and then to 0 at the bottom, yeah? So that's sort of the range of population sizes that we can expect at all levels of competition or harvest. And then what we see is that it makes sense that at the highest level of competition and harvest, the population will be the smallest. And so this can help us to explore like what we call parameter space and what is an expectation of the population size. And if we were to implement some type of management that might affect these values, we can also simulate that too, which is my next steps that I'm hoping to do, using the data on fish diets, using data from the historic fishery to make the model more realistic. So the graphs I showed you guys are more of like what we call like exploring the space of parameters to get in a sense for what might have happened due to fishing and competition. And that's why ecological models are a really important tool. And then so in conclusion, so from the historical research I'm doing, some of the things I'm hoping to do are preserve traditional knowledge about forage fish, predict causes of their decline. With my diet study, I'm hoping to compare diets, get an idea of, food web ecology, food web dynamics in our estuaries to figure out, are these fish safe to eat? Are they being impacted by pollutants? Are there non-native species competing with them? And then in terms of the ecological modeling, I'm trying to predict how different management actions might, like habitat protection or removing species like gold spot herring, what type of impact that could have on Nehu. And then some other things I'm exploring in terms of that management pathway that I've been able to be involved with my research have been here. These are tanks in front of the Maui Beach Hotel. Before the pandemic started, I was hoping to help set these up and get them growing limu. And the thought behind these tanks are to grow limu and then outplant it into Kahului Harbor right in front of it to try and improve the habitat for the food that Nehu eat. And so taking that approach of restoring the ecosystem to provide better habitat for forage fish. Then next is restoring habitats that are covered in mangrove. Like this is a pond at Mokuolo'e, where I work. And this pond was actually used historically for storing nehu. And a lot of research that went on at HIMB was focused on nehu. And the bait would be stored in here, and the boat would be stored by the bridge a little more up that recently fell into the water. And then this is that pond today. So it's almost like we could look into doing experiments or trying to trap the forage fish in here again and do different types of research on them. And then also doing stream-based surveys with DAR, the Department of Division of Aquatic Resources, and supporting their estuary monitoring. So from doing this type of survey work, using that data, I can inform my model better because I can predict what kind of predators are out there and how many of them, and put in a variable for that into the model for how much of them are eaten by predators. So that's some ways that this data is useful. And why it's important to look at other things, like concrete on the ground restoration work, also looking at, ecological models, genetic sequence data. All can tie in and be important. But yeah, and with that, I'd like to say mahalo for sticking with me. Sorry, I ended up talking for longer than I thought I would, but mahalo everybody for sticking in. Good to see everybody. And yeah, I'd like to thank my committee, because I can't do this work alone. My committee members are Dr. Rob Tonin, Brian Bowen, Noilani Puniwai, Lisa McManus, and Matthew Ayaki. And also all the places teach me as well that I go to, I get to spend time in different estuaries, sampling in them, and learning from those places. And then also from the fishermen too, who are willing to speak with me and share their ike, has been very important. And yeah, with that, I'd like to say mahalo everybody, and I'll take any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nakoa. That was really, really, my mind is just going. That was so interesting. And I learned so much information, and I do have like 100 questions at this point. But before we do that, there were some questions in the chat. And so why don't we just go through the questions that were in the chat, and then if there's any more questions, you guys can just unmute after or continue to put them in the chat. But yeah, so earlier on in the discussion, sort of in the beginning, Auntie Maka'ala mentioned that she's interested in the issue of Muliwai dredging and that impact on this fishery. And she also said that she's interested in the impacts of fertilizer from nearby Lo'ikalo.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question, Auntie, because something that relates to that I know about is that in Kaneohe Bay, from about 1950 through the 70s, sewage was being pumped directly into the bay. And like initially, you would think, oh yeah, that pollution, straight sewage water is just gonna kill everything, especially fish, it's gonna harm the fish. But kind of an alternative point of view that what a professor talked to me about was that, maybe that sewage pollution or things like fertilizer, when it's going into the ocean, it's artificially sort of increasing nutrient levels, making more nutrients available for everything else. And so it's sort of making a chain reaction that's not necessarily natural, where you're creating all this food for everything else that wasn't there. So like a surplus. So it could have actually benefited certain species, like in the sense that the fertilizer created the nutrients that created a big increase in plankton levels, which supplied more food and allowed the forage fish to be at a higher level than they should have been. But it's hard to prove that. That's the difficult thing. But the other thing with fertilizers too is that they are harmful in the sense that they can potentially carry things that might be chemicals that are harmful to reproductive organs of species. So that's one thing I know, like endocrine disruptors, which what they do is they can mutate like the ovaries or the gonads, the reproductive organs of species, and make them infertile, or just disrupt that aspect of their development. And that would affect species at all levels, in the food chain and whatever's in contact with it. Yeah, so it's hard to say exactly, but that's kind of my idea of what fertilizer is doing in those environments.
Awesome. And Auntie had a couple of more questions too, so we'll just go over those. Let's see, where do longliners get their bait in Hawaii now? You mentioned longliners and using bait. So where do they get their bait now? And then also, Auntie was curious, is riparian haubush good or bad for forage fish?
Okay, so I'll go with the first one. I'm not specifically sure where the longliners get their bait from, but I know that a lot of it is probably imported from the mainland or other places in the Pacific as frozen bait, or trying to think what they use, or they're using like frozen opelu potentially, but I feel like that's more expensive than of a bait, than like imported anchovies or squid. But they don't really use the bait fish so that's the thing too, is that forage fish, they weren't, once the aqua fishery ended, there wasn't really commercial harvest happening, but the fish still aren't really abundant. So it's leading to some evidence like, okay, maybe fishing isn't the direct cause of their decline, at least now. And then what was the other question about the how?
Haubush, yeah, is haubush good or bad for resource fish habitat? I'm guessing Auntie's talking about.
I would, what I think is that, too much of anything is not good. And if you think about like how completely being out of control in some of our lower estuary areas, I don't think it's a good thing, because it's supporting a anoxic environment, which means like low oxygen in terms of, it's shading, it's creating all that plant matter that's falling and decaying. It's slowing down water flow through the system. So it's probably creating an environment that's not the greatest for a lot of our native stream and estuary species. But it's not invasive, even though it sort of seems like it grows like one. Yeah. So I think removing too much of it is not a good thing, just like anything else. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, let's see. Next one was Hannah, and Hannah had a couple of questions related to the gold spot herring. What does that fish grow up to be? And also, what fish eats the gold spot herring, and do those fish then get poisoned from eating that fish, she wonders?
Yeah, so the gold spot herring, yeah, it just grows up to be adult version of what it looks like as when it's little, and it's just about 6 inches long. A lot of people locally call them sardines. That's what I found. Everyone calls them, they're like, oh, that's the sardine or a sardine pile. But in most cases, I've seen that it's not a sardine. That's what species it is. And you can tell because they have this little yellow dot on the back of their head, right behind the gill plate. That's how you tell them apart. But and the second part to the question, they could potentially, yeah, if they do have harmful substances in their body, it's likely that whatever eats them is gonna catch that too, whatever it is in them, So, but there's not, as far as I know, nobody has a sense for what, if that's happening or not. Yeah, but I have seen, I'm trying to think of what I see eating them. I just saw something eat one the other day. I'm trying to think like, because when I go to the harbors, yeah, I kind of watch what species are around. So I've seen auku'u eat them. I've seen egrets eat them. what else? But I feel like a lot of the predatory fish, I saw papios come swipe at them the other day by Hey up here. But I feel like they're not really the preferred fish that the predators want to eat, because it's like, I'll periodically see something try to eat the gold spot herring. But whenever I see nehu, there's like big predators like coming at them, like chasing them on shore or blowing up the water to get them. So I feel like there's something about like the nehu and even the yao that the predators like more. Hard to say what that is though. And the other thing too about gold spot herring, because they grow larger, they actually are capable of escaping predation or being eaten to some effect by predators once they get to a certain size. Yeah. And I like to think of it as like, if you had a bunch of hyenas versus lions in the same area, who's going to be dominant? Yeah. The bigger guys, right? They're going to overcrowd and sort of be the bosses of the territory. So I feel like their presence might be forcing the native species out of the area. Yeah. But that's another topic too that it's not really documented. Just what I think is happening.
Awesome. Gosh, this is really mahalo nui, Nakoa. I'm learning so much. Let's see, and I call on for the dogs barking. Mailman time. Let's see, there was a couple of questions from Uncle Bob. And he had two interesting questions. What are some of the reasons that the aku fishery went down? And then also, is tilapia a problem in Muliwai?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because I've been finding out more about this, as I've gone along in my research, why the aku fishery declined. And there's several reasons, some people, like one reason that might not be as important was the decline of bait. And there's a series of reports from the 80s, the late 80s, where they talk about like, we need to know more about the bait fish and what's happening to them, and we have to manage them better. That's a big, or do stock assessments. But then there's like not really any studies done on it after that point. And so the decline of bait might be one reason, but it might not be as important as the fact that fishing technology constantly improves and better technology came along that made it cheaper and more productive, like long lining as a method to catch fish. Also, the aku boats, they were aging in the fleet. The aku boat fleet was aging, and it was difficult to insure the boats. That was one reason as well. And it was costing more to operate in terms of like the fuel they needed. So there's all these reasons. And then there's also the fact that, they say that the aku schools were like further offshore or not as large as they used to be, especially today. So that made the fishery less productive. Yeah, so there's all these like different subtle, there's like different evidence of it, but it's hard to track down and locate like one reason. But eventually the aqua fishery did stop, and there's one boat called the Nisei that's docked in Kewalo, and it's been there since I moved to Oahu for the last like 5-6 years, and it hasn't been operating since then. But I think into the 2000s, it was the only aku boat left, and it was operating in Kaneohe. And as far as tilapia, they are, to me, in my opinion, they are very much causing havoc and a negative impacts in our estuaries. They kind of gross me out, even though we can eat them, but like when you catch them and they're mouth brooders and they just spit out all their babies, like hundreds of babies, it's pretty crazy to see that. But to me, they're just so disruptive, in the ecosystem, and we should be like just completely trying to eradicate them, even though it's likely impossible, but at least, making some effort to remove them, along with other non-native fish like the mollies, the guppies, mosquito fish, all of those things. To me, they're just rubbish, in our streams and estuaries. And they could be eating nehu too. They could be disrupting a bunch of native species and consuming them. And the fact that they're so well adapted, for low oxygen environments, and they have few predators, is just makes it worse. Yeah. So huge problem.
Yeah, thank you, Nako. I was kind of cracking up when you were talking about the tilapia and the babies. And I remember I had caught a tilapia and got the hook out, and then that happened. And I just was like, bah, and I dropped the fish, and it survived, unfortunately, due to my shock of not knowing that that was a thing. There's a good question from Bert. Have you done any analysis on connectivity between populations?
So good question, Bert. So my initial project when I came into graduate school and I applied, that was like what my project was supposed to be. And I thought I was just going to come in and do a master's on connectivity of Nehu by itself. And that was going to be one of my chapters. But then I ended up shifting because I couldn't find Nehu. Like I couldn't find a big island population. And that's what I really wanted, was to have like a 3-island comparison: Oahu, Maui, and Big Island. And so because of that, my advisor suggested like, oh, why don't we just study the diet? And then that'll give a good sense of like what's happening, in terms of the food web, and maybe looking into other impacts on their population. But the connectivity side is actually very important. So connectivity is looking at, are these populations of Nehu on different islands isolated or connected to each other? And is one population potentially supplying eggs as a source of larvae to a sink population somewhere else? Or even understanding, on the island of Oahu, are these species mixing or are they isolated? And it's hard to say for me because they're pretty much restricted to an estuary. They only like to live in that one place. And they're not that big, so they can't swim far, but they can disperse by currents. And so I have all the DNA extracted from all my populations of Nehu, so it's kind of just sitting on the back burner or in the freezer actually right now. but that's potentially like a 4th chapter or something I plan on finishing up when I'm done with my PhD. Yeah, as the next thing to look at. And even a lot of the sequence data I have from the diet will probably have a lot of the fish DNA in there as well. So that might be useful too. And what I want to do with that is find out where Nehu fits in the family tree of different relative species found in other locations. And there's other techniques for doing that. That's called phylogeny. So trying to construct, to find out if Nehu evolved from, or did other species evolve from Nehu? It's hard to say which species are more ancient. And that has important, it's important to understand that for understanding the evolution of these species and what sort of pathway they took. Yeah, good question, Bert.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I was always kind of wondering when you were going to get to that part. I just always go back to Pu'uloa. There's mo'olelo about connectivity, so if you could do that one, that would be my advice.
Yeah. Yep, that's the plan though. Yeah.
Awesome.
I love that so much. There is, I have a kind of a comment question, but before I get to that, there's some discussion in the chat. Lehua was wondering if you'd had a chance to vala'au with the owners of the Nisei. And if you haven't yet, were you planning to? And that's such a cool idea, right? To talk story with them. And then Hannah was mentioning that they were actually trying to look for that particular vessel yesterday and didn't see it. That it might have been moved by now. So just side note that there's some consensus that it'd be really cool if you could to talk to them about their.
Yeah, I do want to talk to them, but I know they're not English speaking. And then every time I went by the boat, whenever I'm in Kewala, I would try to go by the boat. I thought about putting a note and maybe reaching out to them because I don't know how to contact them. But someone mentioned to me that one of the important staff on the boat, or the captain passed away. And that was one reason why they weren't operating. But I don't know, you know, so, but I do want to talk to them, actually. That's important. I try and reach out. But I haven't done it yet. But
Yeah. I wonder if you could go the DLNR HA registration number route.
or to get the
Get a-
contact.
yeah, maybe. So you mentioned earlier a couple of times about potentially one of the threats to forage fish being sort of lack of their food source. And then you talked about limu, and it made me think, you know, I do a lot of limu stuff, and recently I've been noticing that certain species of limu are just chock full of these little tiny, you know, shrimp like little amphipod type little, anyway. I had taken a hand sample of some alani a couple of weeks ago near Haleiwa. And when I picked up the sprig, you know, it was maybe this big. My hand was covered in those, just like 1,000 of those little tiny
Look like fleas,
shrimp.
yeah.
Yeah. And it would make sense that that would be a food source. And you kind of showed it in that slide, where that old slide that showed stomach contents, and it was a lot of, like, you know, copepods and things like that. But I'm wondering if, you know, you're seeing that decline in limu having a big effect on the decline of forage fish.
Well, I think it makes sense, you know, in my mind. Like, it's like, oh yeah, that's when you know that it used to be there. Like, I guess it's like, you gotta think of limu as a habitat type, and or at least a really important component of the habitat. Just like how coral is important on a reef, you know, limu in the estuary is like, it's like a foundation and base for things to grow off of, sort of. And I'm trying to think where other places, I think more so than the limu being gone is the human impact that caused that to happen. And I think a lot of times that's linked to dredging of harbors, completely disrupt the whole area, you know. And then also disruptions to water circulation and freshwater input. And to me, Kauai High is a perfect example, because that's where my kupuna are from. And then when I talk to people from there, they talk about like, oh, the reef was beautiful before in the 50s. And people caught nehu there. I know it was like a historic baiting ground. But when they created the harbor and fresh water was like completely diverted, it likely like killed off the species in there, you know. Even though I saw eows in there, just a real small amount. That's all I was able to find in that area. But to me, it's like, but it's weird to me that I find nehu in Pearl Harbor, which to me is like one of the most polluted sites you could possibly have. And they're still surviving in there. But so they can at least withstand some degree of impact, but maybe there's like a tipping point where it becomes too much. And then the other thing too, you know, there could be other larger circulation patterns in the ocean happening, like El Nino events, La Nina, that are shifting, you know, how these species respond. And especially with climate change and the you know, we're having less rainfall, less days of trade winds, that all is probably having some type of impact on the forage fish.
Yeah. Gosh, so interesting, right? To just keep figuring it out, and, you know, asking those questions and trying to find those answers. Last main one in the chat before we just open it up to questions. Brenda mentioned that she's interested in any data or Levi'a conversations you've had about Conda mullet, if you think their introduction led to a phase shift, or just how they fit into the picture of observed declines in Pua'ama recruitment.
That's a good one, Brenda. So, so my thoughts on that are that, first of all, Conda mullet doesn't belong in the estuary, just like with tilapia and all those other things. Yeah, it just doesn't belong there, and it's competing with native mullet, and it has competitive advantages, like just because of its physiology. You know, it reproduces quicker. It doesn't grow as big, but it reproduces quicker, and it seems to be, because of that, it probably can adapt quicker to environmental changes because of shorter generation time. I've even heard that they potentially, I know it was a concern at one point in Hilo that they were interbreeding with native mullet and mixing the genetic stock. So I don't know how much truth there is to that. But that's another potential impact, just like how, you know, the Koloa duck on interbreeding with the mallard duck, you know, and diluting its genetics. So that's another potential impact. But yeah, I think condom mullet, yeah, they're not good in the ecosystem just for those reasons. But they're still edible, and they still could potentially be used for other things, you know, but it's very difficult to get rid of them completely. Yeah, but that's another species along with tilapia. Like, I feel like our conservation outlook should just be to remove them from the ecosystem, which people will agree with or disagree with. But that's, and a lot of people might say that's not going to do anything, and they could be right, because when you introduce a marine species and it becomes abundant, it's almost impossible. You're basically just trimming the herd kind of every time. But it's still better than nothing, yeah, to me. Yeah.
Awesome.
But and then the other problem too, you know, is because the condom mullet's in there, it doesn't belong there. It's competing with the native species, so it's impacting their survival in that way, and also, you know, they gotta compete for limited resources, and it's just taking that away. Yeah.
Yeah, totally right. Good question, Brenda. Thank you. So yeah, I'm just going to open it up. If anybody just wants to ask questions directly, if you're shy, you can still put them in the chat and we'll go back to the chat. But for now, if anybody has any questions, you can just, there you go. Ellie's got her hands up. Go ahead, Ellie.
Hi, mahalo for your talk again. I was wondering, could you go back to a moment to the heat map that you showed us, the graph with comparing the competition and harvest?
Can you see it?
Yeah, I could see that. So the on the left side of the graph on the y-axis, that's the competition, right?
Yeah, so it's like a coefficient
Okay.
of competition, and it's supposed to represent how strongly the gold spot herring is influencing the nehu. And
Okay,
there's
so
also
then,
the opposite of that too, yeah. So there's the impact of the nehu on the gold spot herring. Yeah.
okay, so then with it's showing that some of the highest am I correct in saying that some of the highest populations, that darkest blue color, is in the top right corner?
Actually, the lowest populations are the blue. So the scale
Okay.
on the right, it sort of goes from a low at the dark blue, and then it increases
2 to 3.5. Okay.
So
then if there's the lowest populations with the competition, with the highest coefficient of competition at the top, would you say that this is the real question? Would you say that the competition is having a higher effect on the nehu populations than the harvest is necessarily? And so then in that sense, I know you said that we could use this to try and inform some management decisions, but traditionally a lot of management decisions are managing the harvest. But if the harvest isn't having as high an effect on the nehu populations as the competition is, I guess what would you say to that, and like how we might use that to inform management if we know that the competition between species is actually what's having a higher effect on their abundance?
Yeah, and so you're exactly right. So that's kind of why this graph is useful, like in a broad sense, is that it's showing that competition seems to have a stronger effect than harvesting. Yeah, and just based on the fact that even at low harvest, high competition can drive down the population. And so to me, the way to sort of look at this, even though this is very general and it's not including like a ton of other aspects that would add realism to it. But in a broad sense, we could give evidence for saying why we need to try and remove gold spot herring from, at least where we can, trying to like start to implement measures to do that, like whether it's netting them with the old style of commercial nets that they use, or even traps, so figuring out effective ways to try and drive down their numbers, and then figuring out what effect that might have over time. Because there's a lot of things going on, yeah, because it's like, this is like a process it's very predictive, and it's predicting like steps in time and what will happen. So you could like project it out. Oh, if we scale down the population size of the gold spot herring artificially, increase their death rate, their mortality, and we scale it for like 5 years, but the competition level is still the same, what might happen? And it might be something different. So that's kind of what the next steps are, how to use that data. It's kind of adding more parameters that aren't in the model right now, that represent a management action. So it's interesting because they're trying to like make a variable in an equation, but it's representing a type of management action that you take.
Got it. That's really interesting. Thank you.
But a lot of it, that's why it's theoretical, yeah. So it's not perfect, but it's at least some type of prediction of what might be happening and what's realistic to expect.
Awesome. That's a good question and observation, Miss Ellie. We told everybody Ellie was really smart, see? Uncle Bob, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm interested in salinity. You talk about a Muliwai, and a Muliwai obviously can have very high or very low salinity depending on seasonality or rainfall or have you. You also talked about the netting of Nehu offshore, and I'm not sure if it's offshore enough so that the salinity is high and there's very little fresh water, and how salinity factors in perhaps to different parts of their life cycle. And it all kind of backs into jump rock down in Waimea. These little tiny guys, I don't know what the hell they are. They look like they're half an inch long, and they swim in a big pool, and you can steer them with your hand. It's kind of fun. But salinity, maybe you could touch on the subject.
Yeah. So at least what's interesting too, the forage fish can tolerate that low salinity and that change. So that's why certain fish can't do that. Yeah. There's a lot of fish that can't handle being in the estuary because of that. But Nehu, they sort of like the shelter of the bay, but they'll go sort of offshore, but not real far offshore, to feed on at night, primarily on plankton. So that's when they're known to be actively feeding more. And the commercial fishery, there was a night baiting operation and a day baiting operation that happened more like around the hours of dawn. But the night bait fishery, they'd be more offshore and like more so in Honolulu Harbor. But so salinity wise, I feel like it's not really affecting them too much because they can tolerate that range of change in salinity. But I feel like salinity and temperature might have an effect on where their food is located. And so they're probably gonna just follow, the pattern of where their food is located. But they're gonna also there must be some aspect of their, like, as when they're larvae, imagine their broadcast spawn as eggs out into the ocean. They have to find their way back in. And I think they must have some type of cue, like a chemical cue for targeting low salinity areas or something that's coming out of a stream, so they know how to get back there or to try and settle, if they can, back in those areas. But I don't think there's actually like documented evidence of that. But that's what I would guess, just like how corals larvae can have chemical cues that tell them where to settle, where's a better area. These fish must have it as well, built into them. So, but salinity, yeah, I feel like, yeah, it doesn't like negatively affect their survival. They can change, they can handle the range of salinities, but the effect of salinity on where their food is and temperature too is probably important. Yeah, but I would need a lot more data to figure that out actually, because there's more oceanographic type of data, which people are doing at HIMB. So that's something else I might want to include too at some point.
Awesome. Great question, Uncle Bob. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Brenda said there's so much future work to do. Totally. Hannah said fantastic research and findings. Mahalo for sharing. Anybody else? Okay, well, if not, Nakoa, was there anything that you wanted to add before we close for the day?
I just wanted to say mahalo for everybody for sticking in, and good to see a lot of my old friends and partners, especially you, Lehua. Good to see you from back in the Moku Papapa days. And yeah, mahalo everyone. And also I'll put my email in the chat in case anyone's interested in asking me more questions later or wants to get in touch. Because to me, this was a good presentation, because it's probably when I present my PhD defense, I'm going to be organizing this information in some type of format that I gave you. So to me, it was like my sort of first attempt at putting all of this together, kind of. So, but when I do defend for my PhD, yeah, I remember everything I learned from this presentation.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And thank you for being willing to present to us today for our Mālama Pūpūkea-Waimea monthly marine science talk story. And thank you to everyone who attended today. We really appreciate you being here. This is recorded, and so we will share the recording on our website. Feel free to share. Nakoa was beautifully done, and we all learned a ton. So mahalo nui loa.
All right. Mahalo, everybody.